Star Walker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 137 of Game Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional RPG podcast. I'm Lex Starwalker, and on this show, we discuss the craft and art of game mastering. Not only do I pass along any knowledge I've gained over 25 plus years of running RPGs, I also share wisdom from guest GMs and listener GMs like you. Today, I'm starting two new series on the show. First, I'm going to begin my series on the roles of the GM. As game masters, we wear a lot of different hats, and there are a lot of skill sets involved with being a good GM. So today, I'm going to discuss the GM as rules arbiter. When it comes to the rules of an RPG, the buck stops at the GM. Most RPGs I've played have something like a rule 0, which gives the GM ultimate authority when it comes to the rules, not the books or the developers of the game. Second, I will begin a series of segments in which I will dig into the player's handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide for D&D 5th edition. If you've been asking for episodes on how to play and or run RPGs, this is for you. Hopefully, I'll tease out some gems from these books that you didn't even know were there. So join me on the journey. Together, we can become game masters, truly worthy of the title. Hey, that sounds like a pretty good episode. I think, anyway. I don't know about you. So welcome back to Game Master's Journey. Welcome to Season 8. Welcome to 2017, everyone. Unless you're listening in the future, in which case, welcome to wherever you are in the time stream. It's really great to be back. I'm really excited to be back with the show and for the 8th season. Game Master's Journey is quickly approaching 2 years old. I can't believe it. The show will turn 2, I believe, in February. Unless it's 3 years old and I lost a year somewhere, which is completely possible. So I like to make announcements at the beginning of the show. First of all, I want to remind you I have a voicemail now. So there are lots of great ways you can find me and get a hold of me, and you can find all that stuff at the website at starwalkerstudios.com. But now you can also call me on voicemail and leave a message. And my voicemail number is 951-GMJ-LEX1. And there you can leave me questions or comments or feedback, and you may even hear yourself on the show. And yeah, so looking forward to getting some voicemails for Season 8. So another thing I want to cover here at the very beginning of the show is I do have a little bit of feedback and kind of an update to our last episode, episode 136, in which I dug into one of the unearthed arcanas that we've gotten from Wizards of the Coast, which gave us an alternate way to build encounters in D&D. And I went through that, and I'm a big fan of this new method. I use it myself, and I've had really good luck with it so far. But I want to clarify that since I posted that episode, I heard from Christopher Ruthenbeck, listener of the show, on our Google Plus community for Game Master's Journey, who told me that actually it is not using different math than what's in the DMG, even though, at first glance, it seems like it is. And the reason for my confusion and other people that were confused by this is it seems that, or it appears that, the solo monster table in that article is based on what are called hard encounters in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So it's using the hard encounter numbers. And the multiple monster tables are actually using the numbers for the medium encounters in the Dungeon Master's Guide. So it's not that they're not jiving with the numbers and the math in the DMG. It's that one table is using hard encounters, the other table is using medium encounters, and it doesn't really spell that out at all. So, the confusion is understandable, but that's what's going on there. So the math does match up between the DMG and this Unearthed Arcana article. However, I would say there is still some disagreement between what we're told in the DMG and what we're told in this article, because the Dungeon Master Guide recommends against ever using a monster with a challenge rating higher than your party's level. It states that such a monster could theoretically or possibly take out a player character with one attack if you're using a monster with a CR higher than the player character's level. However, when you look at the solo monster table in the Unearthed Arcana, not only are they recommending oftentimes using monsters of CR higher than the party's level, but those are legendary monsters. So that's a bit of a discrepancy. So maybe it's a thing of the recommendation in the DMG of, don't use a CR higher than your party's level. Maybe that's for kind of novice DMs to keep you out of the danger zone of where encounters could be more challenging or deadly. That could be. I don't know, but that's the way it is. And also in episode 136, I mentioned that I'm kind of hand waving any effect that making a non-legendary creature legendary would have on the challenge rating. And, my thought behind that was that I almost always use the milestone XP method, or I just tell the players when they level or something like that. I don't really hand out XP or track XP from encounters or anything like that in 5th edition. So I was just thinking, well, honestly, the CR doesn't matter because I'm not handing out XP, which would be based on CR. So it doesn't really matter to me what the new CR of this monster that I made legendary is. However, I was overlooking the fact that that CR number is very useful when you're deciding, what would be an appropriate challenge for your player characters and what would be, what would give them the level of challenge that you're wanting to give them. And in that case, knowing what this monster CR would be very helpful. And obviously, taking a non-legendary monster and making it legendary would increase its CR. As Christopher mentioned in the same discussion on the Google Plus community, the legendary attacks alone would result in much higher damage output, which has a very definite effect on the CR of the monster. So as Christopher pointed out, it would be pretty easy to figure out the offensive side of it. You can easily figure out how many more attacks it's getting from the legendary actions and figure out how much more damage that would be and figure out how that would affect the CR. What would be a little more tricky is figuring out what impact the legendary resistances would have, as well as the impact of any other legendary abilities you gave it, like movement or being able to turn invisible or things like that. That's a little more sticky. The only guidance I could find as far as, how would the legendary resistances impact the CR of the creature was in the section on the saving throws for monsters in the discussion in the DMG on creating your own monsters and coming up with stat blocks for them. So the closest thing I could find to kind of help with this is there is discussion of, if a monster has 3 or more good saving throw bonuses, so basically they're proficient in 3 or more saving throws, that you would increase its effective armor class by 2 when determining its CR. And this is part of the process of determining what CR a homemade monster is. So you're not actually increasing its actual armor class by 2, just its effective armor class that you're using to figure out that CR. So maybe increasing that armor class by 2 or by 3 maybe, or maybe increasing it by 1 for each of those legendary resistances. One of those might work. I don't know. Playtesting is needed. And something I realized, and I didn't realize this until I was looking at all this in response to my discussion with Christopher, is there's actually no guidance given whatsoever in the Dungeon Master's Guide, in the section on designing your own monsters, on figuring out the CR of a legendary monster. There's no mention of legendary abilities, legendary resistances, lair actions, legendary actions, anything like that. There's no mention of it whatsoever. So we have no guidance at all for creating homebrewed legendary monsters and having any idea of what their CR would be, or at least beyond, their damage output and armor class and stuff like that. We don't really know how the other legendary aspects of a monster would figure in. And then something else that came out of feedback to this episode is there's part of this, the discussion I had about taking a regular monster from the monster manual and making a legendary version to use as a quote boss fight for your players. There's one really important part of that I forgot to mention. The legendary resistances are going to help a little bit with your monster staying power. The legendary actions are going to help you balance the action economy between this solo monster and your group of player characters. But the one big thing that I forgot is something that you may want to also do, in addition to all the stuff I mentioned in episode 136, is you may want to consider, instead of giving your monster the average number of hit points for their hit dice and constitution, instead give them the maximum hit points. And this is something, people from Wizards have recommended themselves in the D&D products as a way to make a monster last longer, is give it maximum hit points. If that seems like too much, give them 75% max hit points. Because when you look in the monster manual and you see the hit points for the monster, that's assuming 50%. So that's assuming they're rolling average. So if their hit die is a D8, that's assuming 4.5 hit points per hit die. So if you're not actually rolling hit points for your monsters, if you're just using that number and you're taking a regular monster, making it legendary, and throwing it alone, solamente, against your player characters as a boss fight, you might want to at least give it 75% max hit points, if not hit point maximum, max hit points for every hit die, just so that it's going to have enough hit points to soak up all those attacks. Because the legendary actions are going to help it dish out more damage. It's going to help balance the action economy, but it doesn't do anything for the staying power of your monster, and your PCs may still wipe it out in a single turn or something. So or a single round, I should say. So if they're taking it out in a single turn, then your PCs are way overpowered. So yeah, I'm going to have to do some experimenting with the legendary thing and just try making some legendary monsters and, throw them at PCs and see kind of what CR do they feel like. But, I feel like the CR rating system is kind of more of an art than a science anyway. I've tried to take a couple monsters from the monster manual and kind of reverse engineer them using the guidelines given in the Dungeon Master Guide, just to see, okay, if I take a beholder, I don't know. I don't honestly remember which monsters I've done this with. I don't think it was a beholder. But if I take a beholder and I put it through this process that they describe in the DMG to figure out what its CR would be, will I actually come up with the CR that Wizards gave it? And almost every monster I tried that with, I came up with a different CR than what Wizards did. Now, you might say, well, Lex, you obviously just did it wrong. And maybe I did. But honestly, it's not that hard to figure out. And I checked my math and it looked like I did it right. So, that tells me that there's more involved to coming up with the CR of a monster than what they've told us in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And I mean, well, we know that for fact now because they didn't tell us anything about legendary. But even ignoring that, there's more to it than just what they tell us in the Dungeon Master's Guide. There's some art or there's some other calculations that they didn't share with us because, try it yourself. Just grab some random monsters from a monster manual, run them through that process in a Dungeon Master's Guide, and see if you come up with the same CR that Wizards did. I bet you don't, at least not for all of them. So, we're not getting the whole picture here. So, this is something we're going to have to figure out. I'm hoping that there's some kind of easy rule, like, oh, you can just assume it adds 2 to the CR, or, if you take a CR monster that's equal to the party level and you make that legendary, they'll be okay. Just don't take one higher than their level or something like that. But playtesting is needed. So thank you, Christopher, for your very insightful comments on this. I really appreciate it. And thanks for going through the calculations and doing the math and figuring out that solo monster table is using the hard difficulty and the multiple monster table is using the medium difficulty. Would have been nice if Wizards would have pointed this out in that document. Would have been nice if they'd actually used their own terminology that they established in the DMG, which they did not use in the Unearthed Arcana. That they did not say medium or hard. They said difficult, which is not one of the difficulties that they've come up with. So it would have been nice if they would have at least had that level of consistency. It would have made this easier. And I'm really curious why they made the solo monsters hard and the multiple monsters medium. That would have been something nice to explain and point out that that's what they were doing. So unfortunately, this is Unearthed Arcana, so who knows if we'll ever see this in print in an actual product. But if we do, I hope that they do a better job of explaining it and they fix some of these issues so that it's more clear and useful to all of us game masters out there.
This is Shane from the Total Party Thrill podcast, and you're listening to Lex Starwalker on Game Master's Journey.
I want to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. Patrons get some cool perks like game material I make for Primordia and access to a special monthly podcast I produce just for the patrons. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my Tier 4 patron, Mr. Steve Strickland. Let's hear it for Steve. You the man. Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, so today I'm going to start my series of segments on the roles of the GM. As I said at the top of the show, as a GM, we wear a lot of different hats. We wear different hats at different times, whether we're running the game or preparing the game. And, it can be difficult if you have someone who's wanting to become a GM and they ask you what's involved. It can be difficult to even think of all the things that's involved, because a lot of times there's things that we're doing and we're not really thinking about it, or it doesn't occur to us. So I thought it would be illuminating and would be very germane to the kind of the spirit of this show to kind of dig into these different roles and take each role and talk about what's involved and if there are any strategies we can use to, do as well as we can at that particular role. So today I want to talk about the GM as rules arbiter. So as the game master, part of your job is to know the rules and enforce the rules, right? That's part of what we do. So one thing to understand, going into this is why do we even have rules? What is the purpose of the rules in the game, whatever game you're playing? And to me, one of the big functions of the rules in an RPG are to ensure that the game is fair, ensure that there is fairness between the game master and the players. So, there are things that the game master is allowed to do. Maybe there are things that the game master isn't allowed to do, depending on the game you're playing. But at the very least, the rules spell that out, right? They tell the players, this is what you can expect from your GM. Also, I think the rules are there to ensure fairness among the players. So one player isn't getting preferential treatment or one player isn't getting the shaft. Everybody is on an equal playing field as far as the rules of the game are concerned. And finally, the rules are just there as a mechanic or a mechanism that you can use to help you decide what happens when it's unclear to you what happens. So for instance, if a player character is going to shoot their bow at someone, well, it's not guaranteed that they hit that person. So we need rules to help us determine what happens. Now, as a GM, part of your job is knowing the rules. Obviously, you can't enforce the rules or be fair with your implementation of the rules if you don't know them. So knowing the rules is the first step. And, part of our job is enforcing the rules and keeping the rules consistent. But sometimes as a GM, you're going to break the rules, and breaking the rules can be okay. If you're in a situation where you're considering breaking a rule, whether that's, a one-time exception or whether you're thinking of changing the rule altogether, you want to consider the possible and likely consequences down the road. So for example, is changing this rule or breaking this rule going to result in the player characters becoming overpowered? Now, you might wonder, why do I care if the player characters become overpowered? Well, other than your game getting ridiculous and turning into a cartoon, which depending on the game you're playing and depending on your group, that may be okay, or it may not. But other than that danger, making your player characters overpowered oftentimes is going to result in actually making your job as a GM harder. It's going to make designing adventures and encounters that are challenging and difficult much more challenging. So, D&D is a perfect example of this. And we just had in episode 136, we had a whole discussion about building encounters and building an encounter that is the level of challenge that you want it to be for your particular group. And a lot of these games, the good games, have systems like this. So D&D has this, here's how to build an encounter that will be challenging but winnable, right? It's not impossible, but it's not going to be a face roll either. It's challenging. And here's how you can do that. Well, as soon as you start making house rules or making rulings that are changing the power level of the PCs in relationship to the rest of the system, you start fucking with that. You start messing that up, and you can very quickly and very easily get to a point where your player characters are so overpowered compared to what the system is assuming that those mechanics for designing encounters become much less useful, or they could even become completely useless. I saw this myself in the 3rd edition in 3.5 days. I think, more than once on the show, I've mentioned a campaign that I ran back in those days. We started at 1st level. We went into epic levels. I think we got to somewhere between 21st and 23rd level in, 3.5 days. And above and beyond, having epic level PCs running around, I gave them power-ups that were above and beyond what the game assumed. For instance, all of the player characters were chosen. So this was a campaign in the Forgotten Realms. And in the Forgotten Realms, at least at the time, they had this idea that you could be chosen by a deity. And it was like you were kind of extra special. You were one of that deity's extra special people in the world. And there were all kinds of in-game benefits that you got. One of those benefits was a +10 to your constitution. Yes, a +10 to your constitution. Now, 3rd edition didn't quite have the bounded accuracy that 5th edition has. Giving a +10 constitution in 3rd edition wasn't quite as big a deal as it is in 5th edition, but it was still pretty close. And to give a 1st level character a +10 to your constitution was pretty insane. And, now I know probably shouldn't have done that. That was probably a bad idea, but I did it. I had numerous player characters that had Spellfire, which basically allowed them to function as a rod of absorption. They could absorb spell levels up to their constitution. So you throw a 3rd level fireball at me, I could just absorb that spell, which means the spell doesn't even affect me, and I get 3 spell levels. And you could use those spell levels to generate a magical attack that did 1d6 damage per spell level. So I could turn that 3rd level fireball into a 3d6 ray of arcane power. Or you could use those spell levels to heal. I think it was 1d4 hit points per spell level. So basically every one of the PCs, and they didn't all have the Spellfire, but a few of them did, first of all, magic was hardly ever going to work on them at all if they didn't want it to. And they got these, extra healing abilities and magical attacks. So yeah, these player characters were way overpowered. And before too long, the encounter building guidelines that I had in 3rd edition were pretty much useless because they were so far beyond what a normal party of their level would be. And as we got further in the game, as we got higher and higher level, it got more and more difficult for me to have any idea of what I could throw at them, that would work and what would be a good challenge. And there were many encounters that I thought would be epic encounters that were face rolls. And it was a mess. And I learned a valuable lesson from that, of having an idea of kind of what the power curve of the game is and not getting the PCs too far on either side of that curve, either above it or below it. So when you're thinking about making a house rule or making a rule exception on the fly, you want to think about, is this going to have an impact on other rules and systems in the game, creating a domino effect of house ruling? Like you have to make more house rules to deal with the previous house rules and the effects of those house rules. Will this new rule result in one PC outshining the rest of the group? This is really important, because you might think, oh, well, this rule is going to benefit this player character, so how could it be bad? Well, is it going to make their character more badass than the other characters? Now the other players feel disgruntled. Now you got to make more rules to cover them so that, you've brought them on par with the other guy. It's just, it just escalates and creates big mess a lot of times. At the end of the day, is this going to make your job more difficult? If not today, then tomorrow or next week or next year. Try to avoid making your job more difficult. We have plenty to do as GMs. Our job is hard enough as it is without us making it more difficult for ourselves. So I think the most important thing when it comes to the GM's role as rules arbiter is fairness. You should treat all your players equally. You should be fair. Don't play favorites. This also means being careful with those house rules and rules variants again, or different interpretations of the rules. Think about what impact this has not only on that particular character, but on the balance of that character with the other characters in the party. Make sure that this new rule or this new interpretation of a rule doesn't make one player character more powerful than the others or make one player character weaker than the others. That can happen too. You can unwittingly nerf a player character with a rules variant or a house rule or a different interpretation of a rule. Also, I think it's a good idea as a GM, before you even sit down with the players at the table, before even session 0, think about where do you stand when it comes to the rules, and then make the players aware of where you stand and try to be consistent. Are you going to try your best to run the game, quote, by the book? Are you a GM who's going to make up your own rules on the fly? And instead of looking up a rule in a book and slowing down the game, you're just going to pull something out of your butt? Would you rather just keep the story going and not worry about the rules at all? Knowing where you stand in this regard can help you better prepare for your games. If you want to run the game by the book, you might want to devote some of your prep time to looking over rules that may come up that session, for example. Also decide whether you want to allow rules discussions at the table during the play of the game. Different GMs are going to have different feelings on this, and your feelings may change over time. That's fine. Just make sure you're communicating it with the players and try to be consistent. Don't change your mind every week. You may want to ask that rules discussions be limited to before or after game sessions and between sessions. If you do this, do your best to bring up any issues that came up during play that you said, hey, we'll talk about this later. For now, we're doing it this way. Remember to bring those back up later when you can have a discussion about it, either at the end of that session, between sessions, or at the beginning of the next session. If your group ends up having a lot of these rules discussions, try to make time for it, maybe at the beginning or at the end of your sessions. So if you have a group, maybe, you're all kind of new to this game and you end up having a lot of these discussions about the rules, plan for it. Think to yourself, okay, the first hour of our session is going to be devoted to any rules discussions that need to happen. So before you launch into the session, ask your players, hey, are there any rules that we need to discuss? Is there anything people want to ask about that you think might come up? Things like that. And, kind of part of this, it's on the players, is to be respectful of this and mindful of this. So if you know that you're going to pull out a spell during this game that you've never used before, that's going to throw up some rules questions, don't wait for the middle of combat when you cast a spell. Right? At the beginning of the session, before the DM starts, say, hey, you know what? I'm planning on using the cloning spell this session. And, this could cause some rules problems. So maybe we should talk about it now before we're in the thick of things. I know sometimes players get this mentality of it's them against the DM and they don't want to show their hand. They don't want to tell the DM that they're going to use greater polymorph this session. They want to surprise them with it, right? Well, you're only hurting yourself, because any good DM who is, this isn't his first time as a DM, is not going to be afraid to stop the game to go read up on the spell and decide how he wants to handle this. And you're just ruining it for yourself and the other players, trying to catch him off guard. I've had players try to do this to me. And me, if I think that's what you're doing, I will be sure to stop the game and maybe even just stop the session and say, well, that's the end of the session because I need time to think of how to deal with this. And I'm not going to be pushed into a corner where I have to decide this instant. I'm going to give myself a week to think about it, and we'll pick up here next week. You know, I don't truck with that bullshit, man. So yeah, if you find your group having a lot of these discussions, or you think that you will because maybe you have new players or maybe you're trying a new game, make some time for it, either at the beginning of the session or at the end. You know, try to remember to ask if there's any questions before you start at the beginning of the session. Any questions that came up last week that you're not sure about, or maybe you leveled up your character and you have a new spell and you're not sure how it's going to work. This is the time to ask those questions before we get into the story. Now, having these discussions in between sessions, say by email or on a forum, or maybe you all get together or something like that, can be really helpful because you're not taking up your limited and valuable game time together to have these rules discussions. However, GMs, be mindful. Can all the players participate equally in those in-between session discussions? And are they comfortable doing so? Maybe you're having these discussions by email in between sessions. Maybe you have a player that isn't good at writing or isn't comfortable with writing, and so they're not really comfortable or able to participate in those discussions fully because you're having it on email. And if that's the case, it's not really fair to that player. Maybe you should have these discussions in person, before or after a session, or you all get together sometime between sessions if you're in that situation, because it's not really fair to the player who can't or doesn't want to write a novel between sessions in these emails every week to have all those discussions on email. Now, some GMs don't mind pausing the action in the middle of a combat or in the middle of a scene to discuss the rules. Just make sure, if that's you as a GM and that's how you're planning to handle it, just make sure that all the players are okay with that and you're not losing players when you do so. Just because you don't mind having a half-hour discussion about how surprise interacts with initiative and reactions at the beginning of a combat doesn't mean that all the players are cool with it. Many players get bored to tears with these kinds of rules discussions, and they just don't care, and they don't want it getting in the way of the story. And if you're doing this all the time and you have players like that, they're going to stop coming to your games. You can actually lose players this way. I've seen it happen, and it's a shame, because it's something that can be easily avoided. Now, some GMs are going to walk some kind of middle road here where they'll allow some discussion of the rules during the game, but only to a certain point, only, if it can be resolved in something like a couple minutes. This is kind of how I tend to be. It's like, if this is something we can resolve quickly at the table, fine. But if it's going to take more than a couple minutes, I'd rather not do it right now. Now, you can actually, as a GM, head off a lot of these rules discussions at the pass by reviewing any rules that you know are likely to come up during that session before the session as part of your prep. So, for instance, if you're going to have a session where you think it's very likely that the holding your breath rules are going to come into play, how do we know how long a player can hold their breath, or a player character, before they start drowning? And then how does drowning work? How long does that take? If there's going to be a combat on a ship and there's a chance people might be going in the water and this might come into play, then review that before the session. That way, when it does come up in play and players start asking, how does this work? You can answer those questions with confidence and with assuredness that you know what you're talking about and you don't have to look it up. If and when you do get into rules discussions or, God forbid, arguments with your players, remember to listen to your players. Yes, you're the GM. Yes, the buck stops with you. Yes, it's your call, but listen to your players because they may have a good idea, or they may have a way of looking at a rule that you didn't think of, and they might be right, or their idea just might be a better or a more fun way to do it than the way you were planning to do it. Do your best to understand where the players are coming from. Even if you can't accommodate a player's interpretation of the rules, try to understand what that player is trying to accomplish or what that player wants. And it may be possible that even though you can't accommodate their interpretation of this rule, you might still be able to give that player what she wants in some other way, once you understand what she really wants. And you might be able to do that in a different way that is allowed by the rules or by your interpretation of the rules. Also decide where you stand on house rules. Are you going to make up a lot of house rules just all over the place? Or are you just going to run it by the book or somewhere in between? What will you do if a house rule that you create later causes problems? Are you going to be okay with retconning things in the game if you need to, if it turns out that a house rule that you made turns out to be unwise, or you end up not liking it because it makes your life a lot harder? Are you going to be okay with just retconning and say, hey guys, that never happened? Or are you going to have to live with that rule until the end of the campaign? Answering these kinds of questions for yourself ahead of time can help you guide yourself in how cavalier or how cautious you're going to be at the table with making house rules and making rulings on the fly. You know, if you're not comfortable retconning things, or if you're not comfortable with changing how you do certain things from session to session, because, let me give an example. Like let's say the surprise thing, because this is something that's come up in my games before. 5th edition has very specific ways of handling surprise and how that interacts with initiative and reactions and stuff like that isn't the same as how it's been done in previous editions. May not be the way that you assume it works if you're experienced with previous editions. And, you could get into this in a combat because certain character class abilities very much depend on the way that surprise works. And if you do it differently, quote, incorrectly, you could screw over certain player characters that rely on surprise working a certain way or rely on reactions working a certain way. So it is important. It's not just your player character or your player being a rules lawyer. It's this aspect of my character, it's actually important that the rule works a certain way. And if it doesn't work that way, then my character doesn't work the way I think it does or I think it should. And that can be a problem. So it's worthy of discussion. But do you want to have that discussion when you called for initiative rolls for this big epic combat you want to have? Maybe, maybe not, right? Depends how long this discussion's going to take, right? So let's take this example. Let's say, you say roll initiative, the player characters are surprised, or maybe the monsters are surprised, or maybe some of both. And you have a player character where this is important, whether or not they get their reaction or how this works with the surprise. It's actually important mechanically for the character and what they want to do. And let's say you decide, well, I don't want to have a half-hour discussion about this. I don't want to take the time to find the passages in the PHB and the DMG to figure this out. So I'm just going to make a ruling on the fly. I have a player character that, what they want to do kind of hinges on this. So I'm going to make a ruling that's friendly to them and what they want to do. But then later after the session, I look up the rule and I find out, well, the ruling I made wasn't really right. What do you do at that point? Do you decide just to stick with the ruling you made in the moment, even though it's not what's in the book, and you're just going to live with that? Or are you going to come up to the player characters at the beginning of the next session and say, hey guys, remember when that thing came up about the surprise and I said we were going to do it this way? Well, since then I've looked in the book and actually it's done this way. So, what happened, but from now on we're going to do it this other way. Or are you going to maybe retcon and say, hey, some of the things that happened in that last combat shouldn't happen. And so we're going to change what happened. Or, how are you going to handle that? These are things to think about before you start running the game, so you kind of know where you stand. And coming up with those answers can help guide you in how free are you going to be with making rulings on the fly or making house rules. If you're okay, if you're like, I'm not going to retcon stuff, but I'm okay with handing a mechanic one way in the moment and then later figuring out the way the rules handle it and maybe changing it from then on, how, as long as I communicate to the players and everybody understands, I'm okay with that. And if that's the case, then you can be more free to make rulings on the fly and not worry about it and be like, hey, I'll figure it out between, before next session, how this really works. But for now, this is how we're going to do it. If, on the other hand, continuity is really important to you and you don't want how things work changing from session to session, then maybe when a question comes up like that, maybe you want to take a break and say, hey, let's take 5. Everybody go to the bathroom, get a drink, and I'm going to figure out how this works. It's going to differ for every GM. The important thing is knowing what's going to make you happy, knowing what's going to make you unhappy, and, hedging your bets so that things run smoothly. So in the end, there's a lot involved with being a rules arbiter and handling the rules of your game as a GM. I could probably do multiple episodes just on this one role. And definitely, if you have questions or ideas or you think there's something I missed or something else that should be said about this, definitely let me know. I will definitely revisit this if I get good feedback from people, if people have more that they think should be said about this. But in the end, I think that the most important things for you to remember as a GM when it comes to the rules are, number 1, be consistent. However you do it consistently, so that your players know what to expect from you and they know how things are going to work. Be as consistent as you can. And if you change something, tell the players and tell them why, and make sure that that everybody's on the same page. Number 2, be fair. Be fair, between the player characters and the non-player characters, make sure that everything fits together well, and be fair among the players. Don't favor one player or always pick on one player, right? If one player gets, a house rule that makes the mover powerful, they all should, right? Don't play favorites. Try to be as fair as you can. Number 3, be approachable. Make sure that the players understand that they can come to you with questions outside of the game. The more approachable you are outside of the game, the less you're going to have to deal with this crap during the game when you're trying to do your epic boss battle, right? So, give the players ways that they can get a hold of you, whether it's text message, calling you, emailing you, whatever. Be available to your players to answer rules questions, to have rules discussions outside of the game if you don't want to be doing it during your limited time together as a group. And finally, number 4, I'd say it's important to be open-minded. This means willingness to listen to a different interpretation of the rules and consider that your interpretation might be wrong. Or maybe it's not a thing or right or wrong. Maybe just this new interpretation is better or more fun or more interesting. Right? Sometimes players have great ideas when it comes to the rules. Don't be afraid to listen to your players. It also means an openness to changing your mind in the future if a rule isn't working, whether that's a rule of the game that's published or a house rule that you came up with, whatever. If a rule isn't working for you and your group, don't be afraid to change it. At the end of the day, the important thing is that everybody has a good time, that everybody has fun, that the players are on equal ground and have equal opportunities to succeed and grow and do the cool things that they want their characters to do. That's what's important, not the rules. The rules are just a means to an end. They're not the end. The end is that everybody has fun and everybody comes back next week for the next chapter of your epic saga. One of my favorite parts of this show is when I hear from listeners like you. There are a lot of great ways that you can get a hold of me and let me know what you think. Visit my website at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney. There you can email me, find my Twitter, Google+, Facebook, Pinterest, and YouTube information, and more. Finally, you can learn about how you can support the show by becoming a patron or making a one-time donation. All that and more at starwalkerstudios.com. So I'm trying something new today. This is something a little different than what I've done on the show before, even different than what I've done on the show's predecessor, GM Intrusions. And I'm going to start through a series of segments and or episodes going through some of the books for D&D. Specifically, I'm going to be talking mainly about the Dungeon Master's Guide And I did a series of episodes way back at the beginning of the show where I kind of dug into the DMG for 5th edition, and I kind of gave an overview of everything that's in there and talked about why I really like it and even use it when I run other games. So I'm not going to retread old ground there. Instead, what I'm going to do is start going through it in more detail. So there's a few reasons I'm starting this series. First of all, I've had requests from people to explain more about just how to play an RPG. For new players who are new to the hobby, how do you play a role-playing game? And specifically, how do you play D&D? But I've had, general, how do you play an RPG questions, and more specific, how do you play D&D questions. So I think that this will be helpful to those people who are new to the hobby and have questions about how we do this thing called playing a tabletop RPG just as a player. I've also had requests to explain more how to run a game as a GM, how to do things like come up with adventures and encounters, just basically how to be a GM. I started a series of episodes a while ago on the show, GM 101, where I started to unpack some of this, how to be a GM for new GMs. But I think by going through the Dungeon Master's Guide and discussing selected things from it in detail will be a great way to kind of structure an explanation of how to be a GM or how to be a DM for those of you who are just starting out. I also think that with the DMG specifically, it may also be helpful to those of you running the game who aren't new DMs, who are fairly experienced at running games. I think it can still be helpful for you, especially I think if you're either new to D&D or you began D&D in a previous edition of the game, because there are a lot of things about 5th edition that are similar to things in previous editions, and there are things that are different, and that kind of applies to any edition you're coming from. So for instance, me, I'm pretty familiar with 3rd edition 3.5, and I see a lot of 5th edition that is similar or exactly like it was in 3rd edition or 3.5. But then there are things that are different. And this actually can make it a little more confusing because sometimes you wonder, am I remembering a mechanic from this version of the game or from the previous version that I'm really well versed with? And when there are some things that are the same and then some things that are different, it can be tricky remembering what's what. So I think, for some GMs out there that maybe, you learned D&D in the 1st edition days or the 2nd edition or 3rd or 4th, there may be certain ways that you're doing things in 5th edition because that's the way you did it before. And you may not even realize that maybe it's the same in 5th edition or maybe it's different. And finally, there are just a lot of gems in the Dungeon Master's Guide that unless you've read the thing cover to cover multiple times, you may have missed. And finally, another reason that I'm doing this is I have had some requests from listeners to do the equivalent of a Let's Read thread that people will do on forums where they'll take a book and discuss it in detail. And I thought that was a cool idea, and that's actually what kind of gave me the idea of doing this with the DMG to begin with. And I thought that I could kill a lot of birds with one stone here by doing this. So I started looking through the DMG and started thinking about what I would talk about, what parts of the book I would want to discuss and whatnot. And quickly began to realize that there actually is a lot to talk about that I think would be very useful on this show. Now, I don't want to get into the very basics of the game. I don't want to get into the core mechanic or, how do you make a character or how do the ability scores work or stuff like that. Like the really basic stuff, like, what die do I roll to hit and stuff like that. I think that most people can figure that kind of stuff out just by reading the book for your RPG of choice. So if we're talking about D&D and you're wanting to play the game, read the player's handbook. I think most people can read the player's handbook and get the basics of how this game is played. Or if you want to run a game, you'd read the player's handbook and the DMG. If you have a game where it's just one core book, like say Numenera, then you would read that book. And most of these books, especially the more, modern ones, are pretty well written to teach you the basics of the game. Another great resource for learning the basics is watching or listening to an actual play of the game that you want to play. So if we're talking about D&D, there are thousands probably of actual plays on YouTube and in podcast form that you could watch or listen to get the basics of how this game is played or how this game is run. For instance, I've done actual plays on YouTube and in podcast form for D&D and Numenera and Star Wars. There's Critical Role. There's lots of actual play out there on YouTube in podcasts that you can watch or listen to. And I think between using the book that you have and those sources of information, that information is out there, the very basics of how to play. I'm more interested in more kind of the higher level stuff, the more intermediate to advanced stuff. Once you've learned the basics, the steps after that. That's what we're going to be talking about. So 5th edition has a lot of optional and variant rules, which is one of the things I really like about this game. Not only are we given one way to play the game, but especially when you start digging into the DMG and even in parts of the player's handbook, we're given lots of options and variants of different ways you can do things so that you could have a handful of DMs running 5th edition and all of their games could be very different, even mechanically, based on which options and which variants they're using. And again, like I mentioned before, this can be a great way for you to try to capture elements of a previous edition of the game that you really liked and you want to maintain. There are also a lot of little rules and systems for the game that many players and even GMs don't know about. There's a lot hidden in these books. So I thought it would be fun to go through some of this with you and keep an eye out for ways that we can customize our games and ways that we can get exactly the experience that we want to get, whatever that is for you. So in the process, I hope that I can satisfy those of you wanting more information on how to play and run RPGs, especially if you're talking about D&D. This is going to be very relevant and useful to you, but I will do my best to tie this in as much as I can to people using other games, because I think a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about, it doesn't really, at the end of the day, matter what game you're playing or what game you're running. Running a game is running a game, and the majority of the aspects of being a game master are the same no matter what game you're running. And the same with being a player. I think this will also be a great resource for people who are coming to 5th edition D&D from previous editions. The various optional and variant rules especially can help you bring in your favorite elements from your edition or editions of choice, and at the same time leaving out things that you didn't care for or that didn't work particularly well for you and your group. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the player's handbook because, the stuff in the DMG is what I really find interesting and is stuff really conducive to these kinds of conversations I want to have. However, as I started going through the DMG and thinking about what I would talk about and what I wouldn't, it became pretty clear that it would be wise to at least do a little bit on the player's handbook, just to set that foundation. Because a lot of times the DMG is going to reference rules and mechanics from the player's handbook, and it would be a little awkward to every time that happened to then have to pull out the player's handbook and go over that little section. I thought it would be a better way to organize it to start out with the player's handbook, hit the highlights there, kind of the DM material, if you will, that's in the player's handbook, and then go on to the DMG, even though the DMG is where I really want to be right now. But there's some good stuff in the player's handbook that we'll talk about. And that way, when we go on to the different variants and the different options, we're all kind of on the same page as far as, what's the assumptions in the game. Now, naturally, these segments are going to evolve based on feedback that I receive from you and my own experience in producing these segments. We may end up in a very different place when we're done than where we are now or where I think we'll end up. We'll see. Based on feedback that I receive, this material may be presented as isolated segments in different episodes, could be entire episodes, or a combination of the two. And again, that will largely depend on how popular these segments are, how much people are enjoying them. The more it seems people are enjoying them, the more often I'll do them. And of course, there's always a chance that this will flop horribly, and we won't go through the whole DMG if most people don't like this. So this is a long journey that we're starting on here. If I actually go through the entire DMG plus the highlights I want to hit from the player's handbook, I mean, even if I did entire episodes on this, it would take dozens of episodes to get through everything. So this is kind of a long-term thing. So don't be worried that this is all you're going to get from Game Master's Journey for the next 50 episodes. I'm going to be doing all the other stuff I usually do too. This is just going to be one element of the show going forward. But again, based on responses I get from you will determine how often I go into this, how long I continue to do this, and how extensively we dig into all of this. All right, so now that we've got all the introductory crap out of the way, I'm going to actually crack open my player's handbook here. Had to take off my glasses. I've gotten old enough now to where I have a hard time reading with my glasses on anymore. So yeah, switching vision modes. So again, there's a lot in the player's handbook that I am not going to cover. If there is something I skip in here that you want discussed, let me know. Shoot me an email, gamemasterjourney@gmail.com. Let me know. If I need to, I can go back and hit something that I skipped over that people thought I shouldn't have skipped over. So if we open our player's handbook, we've got the obligatory preface, introduction, whatever. And this, this has some of the basic, how do I play this game for people that have no idea what's involved. So if that's you, definitely, start at page 1 and start reading there, and don't skip this introductory stuff, because this is for you. We go into here the basic mechanics and the basic, how a tabletop RPG works. So there are a couple things that I want to call out from this section of the book. First is on page 7, specific beats general. And if you're new to the hobby, or if you're a player who is going to start running games for your first time, this is a very important concept to wrap your head around. And I think this is fairly universal in all tabletop RPGs. I think most, if not all, tabletop RPGs have this kind of specific beats general thing. If you've played Magic the Gathering, the card game, or something similar to it, it's the exact same thing. In Magic, there are basic rules that make up the game that we follow, but a specific rule on an individual Magic card always trumps the general rules. So if you have a specific rule on your card that tells you to do something different than what the more general rules tell you, then you do what's on the card. Specific beats general. So it's the same kind of thing here. In the player's handbook and in the Dungeon Master's Guide, we set up a structure of mechanics of this is in general how things in the game work. But anytime you find a more specific rule, whether it's more specific because it's about a specific character or a specific item or weapon or piece of armor or a specific character class or a specific spell or whatever, anytime you see a rule that is more specific, that rule takes priority over a general rule. So if it seems to be in conflict with the general rule, you go with the more specific rule. Now, that doesn't mean that that general rule is no longer true ever. It just means in that one specific instance, it works differently. Okay? And some of you might be scratching your heads right now and being like, why the hell is Lex even talking about this? Obviously, duh. But this isn't obvious to all people, and especially with newer gamers. People can get kind of hung up and confused by this, where they see a specific rule and they think that because of that very specific rule, it changes the general rule, and that specific rule applies to all these other situations that don't really have anything to do with that specific rule. And so, this is a very important concept to grasp. Let's see what the book actually says about it. This book contains rules, especially in parts 2 and 3, that govern how the game plays. That said, many racial traits, class features, spells, magic items, monster abilities, and other game elements break the general rules in some way, creating an exception to how the rest of the game works. Remember this: if a specific rule contradicts a general rule, the specific rule wins. Exceptions to the rules are often minor. For instance, many adventurers don't have proficiency with longbows, but every wood elf does because of a racial trait. That trait creates a minor exception in the game. Other examples of rule breaking are more conspicuous. For instance, an adventurer can't normally pass through walls, but some spells make that possible. Magic accounts for most of the major exceptions to the rules. Pretty cut and dry, right? I think I've already spent too much time on this. Another one is round down. This is a general rule that applies to the game. Whenever you divide numbers in the game and you end up with a fraction or a decimal, you always round down unless something specifically tells you to do otherwise. Again, remember, specific over general, right? Specific beats general. So there are certain spells or attacks or mechanics in the game that will tell you to round up or tell you that you round down unless you would end up with a number less than 1 and then it's 1 or something like that. So again, if there's a specific rule, it overrides this. I'm really trying not to use the word Trump because I don't think that word's going to mean what it used to mean for much longer. And I want this show to be relevant in the future and people not to be confused what I'm talking about. But this general rule is anytime you're dividing numbers, unless there's something telling you differently, you always round down. This is something else I see confusing people a lot more than I think it should. It's really cut and dry. Just if there's a decimal, just ignore everything after the decimal. It doesn't matter. And the last thing in this first section, this introduction, that I want to just hit on are the 3 pillars of adventure. And here they're just talking about, they believe in D&D there are 3 main elements to the game, and that is exploration, social interaction, and combat. And if you want to know more about those, it's on page 8. You can read more about it. They're pretty self-explanatory. Exploration is everything from looking for traps in a dungeon to mapping out a dungeon to visiting a new country or a new city or a new world or a new plane. Anything like that can be exploration. Discovering new magic items is part of exploration. Social interaction is just all the social things you do among the players and with non-player characters. Lying, cheating, talking to people, persuading, deceiving, intimidating, all that stuff. And then combat is fighting, whether it's physically, magically, whatever. This is basically just saying that these are the 3 pedestals of the game, and that the game tends to work the best when you try to give equal weight to those 3 pedestals. So this is something that, Wizards uses in design. So if they're going to come up with a new class or a new class archetype, they try to make sure that it addresses all 3 of these pillars. So, your class ability should have something that helps you with combat, something that helps you with social interaction, and something that helps you with exploration. That kind of thing. It's also something to think about as a GM when you're creating adventures, when you're creating encounters, and when you're creating campaigns. Now, every single encounter doesn't necessarily need to have an equal balance of the 3 pillars, and every single adventure doesn't need to necessarily have that balance. And even every campaign doesn't need to have that balance. It all depends. But it's a good thing to shoot for. And one thing nice about these 3 pillars is different players, and we'll get into this a little bit when we get to the DMG and we talk about different types of players, but different players will gravitate towards different pillars. So you'll have some players that really love the combat part of the game. Some players really love the exploration part. Some people really love the social interaction part. So the idea is if, you have a random group of players and you have a pretty good spread of what people like, and not everybody's the same, which is probably true for most groups, not everybody's the same, then if you try to equally represent these three pillars throughout, say, your campaign, then theoretically you'll be keeping all those players happy, even though player A really likes combat and player B really likes the social stuff and player C really likes exploration. If you try to balance those three pillars throughout the campaign, theoretically, all three of those players will be content. That's the idea anyway. So that's why, again, this is a case of specific beats general. These are all general statements I'm saying. So in your particular group, maybe all the players in your group love the combat, they love the exploration, but they don't really get into the social interaction and they're frankly bored by it. Then you don't need to so much worry about that pillar of the game. You can focus more on the combat and the exploration, as an example. So, you always want to think about your specific group of players and what works for them specifically. But generally speaking, it's seen as a good idea to try to balance those. And like I said, you don't have to balance it every session or even every adventure. So maybe you have a very particular adventure in your campaign that's very combat heavy, but then you have another adventure that's much more social interaction. The idea is if you have a pretty even spread at your table as far as which of the pillars people enjoy, that over the entirety of the campaign, it's equal. So even though a few sessions were very combat heavy, well, then we'll have some sessions that have more exploration and more social interaction to make up for it. All right, so next we go into part one of the PHB, which is creating a character. A lot of this stuff I'm gonna skip. This is pretty straightforward stuff, building a character. And I'm sure there are plenty of great sources of information out there if you need help with this more kind of basic, how do I make my character kind of stuff. I would definitely recommend reading this if you're new to the game, but I don't think we're going to go through much of this right now. Again, if you want me to go through specific things, feel free to let me know. I can always come back and hit something. So chapter 1 is step-by-step characters. One thing that is interesting in here, kind of more general stuff, is the tiers of play, starting on page 15. And this introduces the tiers of play. We're going to talk more about the tiers of play when we get into the DMG, because the DMG starts talking about what kinds of adventures are most appropriate for the different tiers of play, which is a really interesting discussion that I want to have. This is just kind of introducing the concept for you and showing you what those tiers are. So tier 1 is level 1 to 4. Tier 2 is level 5 to 10. Tier 3 is level 11 to 16. And tier 4 is level 17 to 20. So this is where you can find your ability score modifiers. If you're using point buy, this is where you can find that information, all at the beginning of chapter 1 here. Chapter 2 is races. So here we have descriptions of all the races in the game, or species would be a more better term for that, a more accurate term. Chapter 3 is classes. So this is descriptions of all the classes, class abilities, lots of stuff here. And if we wanted to, we could get into nitty gritty on all the mechanics in this part of the book, but we're moving on. Chapter 4, personality and background. Here we have weight tables, height and weight tables, which are provided for all the PC races here in the book, where you can randomly determine your height and weight if you want, or you can just choose something within that range. That's usually what I do. Now, one thing that is kind of helpful here, and I don't know how much thought or research went into these numbers, but one thing I find helpful in this table is the correlation between height and weight based on your race. And again, if we really scrutinize this, it could be that it's not really doing a great job of this. I have no idea. I've never really tried to pick it apart. But for instance, if I want to play a high elf and I know how tall I want to be, I can use this table to figure out how much that character could weigh, because the height to weight relationship isn't necessarily the same for an elf as it is for a human. Elves tend to be not as heavily muscled as humans, so I would think that a 6 foot tall elf would tend to be lighter than a 6 foot tall human on average. Dwarves, same thing. Dwarves are even heavier still. So a 5 foot tall dwarf would weigh a lot more than a 5 foot tall human, and even more than a 5 foot tall elf, right? So these tables have worked the same way for as long as I can remember, since I think first edition at least. And it can be a little confusing to the uninitiated. So basically the way this works, if you wanted to do it randomly, let's take the human. Your base height is 4 foot 8 inches, and then you roll 2d10, and that's a number of inches you're going to add to 4 foot 8 inches to determine how tall you all are. So let's say you rolled 2d10 and you rolled 4, that would be 4 foot 12 inches or 5 feet tall. Okay. Then you take that same number that you just rolled. So in our example 4, the number you get from the 2d10, you multiply that times the number you get from the weight multiplier. So for human, it's times 2d4. Okay. And then you add that number to the base weight. Sounds more confusing than it is. So let's say on my 2d10 for the height modifier, I rolled a 4. I added 4 inches to my height, making myself 5 foot tall. And let's say for the weight, I also roll 4 on my 2d4. So I would take 4 from the height modifier times 4 from the weight modifier, 16, and add that to my base weight of 110 to give me 126 pounds. So this is just ensuring that your weight is reflecting your height. So the taller you are, the more you weigh, kind of thing. And the way that I tend to use this, I don't tend to randomly determine my height and weight. I tend to choose a height. So let's say I want to be an elf. I want to be a high elf. I see here that a high elf base weight is 4 foot 6, and I roll 2d10 to add to that. So the minimum I could roll on a 2d10 is 2, right? So the minimum height for a high elf would be 4 foot 8, 4 foot 6 plus 2 inches. The maximum I could roll on 2d10 is 20. So if I add 20 inches to 4 foot 6, that would be what? Let's see, 6 foot 2, I think. It'd be a lot easier if they just gave the height in inches, but they don't. So let's say it's 6 foot 2. So my high elf could be anywhere from 4 foot 8 to 6 foot 2. I'm going to say my high elf is 6 feet tall, even. Okay. So the way I use this table is, now that I've decided I'm 6 feet tall, I use a table to figure out how much I would weigh so that my height to weight ratio fits what makes sense for an elf. So high elf, 4 foot 6. In order to get to 6 foot, what would I have to add to that? I'm trying to figure out what I would have rolled on 2d10 to get to 6 foot. Well, 6 inches brings me up to 4 foot 12, which is 5 feet. And then another 12 inches would bring me up to 6 feet. So that's 6 plus 12, 18 inches. So to be a 6 foot elf, I would have rolled 18 on the 2d10. So then I could roll my 1d4 for my weight modifier, multiply that by 18, add that to my base weight of 90, and that would tell me how much I weigh. So let's say I roll 2 on my 1d4 for my weight multiplier or my weight modifier. So I would take 2 times 18 is 36, plus 90 pounds would be what? 126 pounds. So my character is 6 foot tall, 126 pounds. And right there, I see a difference, because I'm 6 foot tall in real life, and I tell you, I weigh quite a bit more than 126 pounds. In fact, even when I was a lanky, skinny teenager at 6 foot tall, I weighed like 135 pounds. So a human 6 foot tall weighing 126 pounds would be super, super skinny, like anorexic looking probably. But again, elves are built differently. So that doesn't mean that my elf looks like he's anorexic. It just means he looks like an elf. All right, so that's that. Probably way more time than I should have spent on that. We have discussion of alignment here. So if you want to find out more about alignment, there you go. Languages, ideals, bonds, and flaws. We have discussion of inspiration. I did a whole episode on inspiration if you want to know what I think about inspiration. Cliff notes, I love it. It's a great way to encourage behavior that you want to see at the table. So I think inspiration is great to use not only for in-game stuff, but also table stuff. You know, if you have one player that always brings snacks for everybody, give his character inspiration. If you have one player that helps the new guy figure things out, give him inspiration. You know, if you have a player that has a really cool idea or tells a really great joke that makes everybody laugh or whatever, anything that you see a player do at the table that you're like, I really like that. I want to see more of that in my game. Handing out inspiration is a great way to encourage behavior that you want to see more of. Backgrounds. And now we go into all the backgrounds. And that is the rest of chapter 4. So we are trucking right along through the player's handbook here. All right, well, that is going to wrap up episode 137, big monster episode today. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing it, and I will be continuing both of these series in future episodes of Season 8. We'll have more episodes about the roles of the GM, and we'll have more episodes or segments where I discuss the player's handbook and ultimately the Dungeon Master's Guide. You have to say it like that. At least Dungeon Master. You have to say it like that, or at least I do. I feel like I do. So I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.